So we're back on the MGTD assembly project, and so far it looks like we're actually going backwards rather than forward. Let's get into it. So at least a portion of this video is really going to be explaining kind of why most restoration shops do not want to or will flat out refuse to take in a partially restored car to finish. I have done it a few times, and usually by the time it's done, I say, I don't think I'm going to do that again, and then a few years later, I do it again. So when you take on one of these partially done projects like this, you just end up spending so much time just sorting through the stuff, because you didn't take it apart, and whoever took it apart may or may not have marked things very well. You don't know what's there. Usually a lot of stuff comes up missing by the time stuff gets shuffled around. And we run into stuff that gets put together that needs to be taken back off because other things needed to be done first, or mistakes that were made early on that they didn't catch that you end up catching. And we did find one on this car that we'll show you later on that is actually, seems like a small thing, but is actually a pretty big mistake. So one of the things the owner wanted was seat belts. Well, in order to properly mount seat belts in this, you got to have the floors, transmission tunnel, and everything out of it, which he already had in, and so I took all of that out. But there's also another reason why I needed to get these out anyway, which we'll get to later. But yes, I do have my Horst shock book here, which is a pretty good reference manual for all the details in these things, and I use their drawings for making all these seatbelt brackets up. Now, I'd already made these seatbelt brackets up. The last time I did this on a car, I made extra brackets. I was only able to find these two brackets. Evidently, the third bracket, I either didn't make extras of those or they got lost in the move, so I'll have to make new ones of those. So one of the things I wanted to sort out before I went any further on this car was getting the bonnet to actually fit both the cowl and the radiator grill shell here. And it just wasn't. And part of the reason, other than being really busy with other stuff, is in the back of my head, I was waiting until I got that aha moment of how I wanted to tackle it. But we got caught up. I decided it's time to figure this out. We got the bonnet lined up across the cowl correctly. It ended up putting the center of the bonnet way too far off center here. So we ended up with a bonnet that wasn't fitting at all. It was overlapping on one side, had a big gap on the other, wasn't fitting back there at all. And this is a really low mileage car. This thing only showing 12,000 miles on the odometer, and we think that's actually correct. But this car sat in the garage for many, many years, and it's actually a really super solid car that's never had any rust repair done to it. When all they had to do was strip this thing to bare metal, do the body work, and paint it. Even the chassis has like no real rust pitting at all in it. It's that good of a car to start with, but it just had a really crappy aftermarket paint job that was done right over top of all of the beading and everything, and sat for so long, that's why it ended up getting restored rather than just recommissioned. So I figured probably what happened was they just didn't get the body quite square on the chassis, so it doesn't line up to the grill anymore. And that's part of why we had to take the floors out as well, because the bolts are under the floor. And the other reason that I made kind of the assumption that it was on crooked is because I could tell these were painted body collar. That means these were taken off the chassis with the body and painted separately from the body because you got the other piece in there, and wasn't left on the chassis. Now, when I've done these in the past, what I will do is once this is all set, everything's lined up, looking really good, fitting good during the body work stages, and I got this located, I leave this bolted down because this gets painted chassis color anyway. So that way, when you go to set the body back on the chassis after painting, it lines the body right up really well right there, and you don't have to spend nearly as much time tweaking, adjusting, and getting things right. And in this case here, this all should have been lined up before you ever touched the fenders. But I don't know if the owner assembled this stuff or the guy doing the body assembled it to get it back to the owner, but all that should have been lined up and done properly first before even fenders were bolted on. Now there may be some T-Series guys out there saying, whoa, that ain't quite the way to do that, and maybe it's not. I do not claim to be a T-Series guru, but I have done T-Series restorations, and one of my T-Series restorations did make the cover of Classic MG magazine, so I do think I know how to put one together well enough to make it present pretty well. And I can't find that copy of the magazine at the moment. If I can find it, I'll put a picture of the cover of it in here. If not, I do have the base photo that the magazine cover was made from, and I can insert that in. So once I got the floors out, I could loosen the bolts up for holding the body down and could make some adjustments to the body positioning on the chassis. Of course, I had to loosen those bolts up too. We got them moved over just a little bit to where the center line looked way closer to center here. Not perfect yet, but you know, I just wanted to see what was going on. And it still didn't look very good, especially along this rubber line here. It was big gap here and tight down on the bottom sides. And I said, something else is wrong here. But my initial thought looking at this car was, being such a low mileage clean car, I wasn't really thinking so much about what had been replaced or how poorly it might have been done. But this wood has been replaced. And that's where our main problems lie once I dug into it. So we pull this loose and we see that the step in the body to the wood is not even remotely even at all. It should be pretty even and about this amount, roughly 3/16 1/4 inch all the way around. But we're almost flush at the top, and down on the side down there, it's a full 1/2 inch. So that is a problem, because as you bring the seal up across here, in order for them to not leave a gap here that water would get in, they pulled that seal all the way back here so that it would seal there. Well, it leaves a huge gap on the bonnet here. When you're looking down here, where this gap is so big here, the step is so big here, effectively, we're not at a right angle here. It's sitting like that. So the further you push in, the further this is pushing forward. And not only does the bonnet now not sit within, you know, this way, it's pushing forward. So when you're touching at the bottom here, you end up with a gap here, which then turns into a much bigger gap here. No matter what you do, you cannot get it right. So the only way to fix this is to do something with the wood itself. I mean, you have to pull all the bolts out and re-drill it. But if you just pull the bolts out and re-drill it and try to put it all back together, then you end up with slots, things move around, it's not going to work. But good news is these pieces of wood are cheap enough to buy that it's actually cheaper to just throw them away and replace them than it is to sit and screw around with, like putting dowels in there and trying to make everything solid before you re-drill them again. Now, one thing you have to remember about this wood is a natural product. It has a grain to it. It is subject to humidity variations and temperature variations. And when you receive one of these pieces of wood, after you order it, you really don't know how long it's been since it was made. The company that makes them will make them in batches. And there is the possibility that that company could have actually had that sitting on the shelf anywhere from a week to a year before it got sent out to one of the suppliers like Abington Spares or Moss Motors. And then they could potentially, because they buy them in batches, have it sitting on their shelf anywhere from a couple weeks to a year before you buy it. And then if you buy it early on in your process and it's sitting in your garage for a while, and maybe it's a year before you actually start putting it together, that means these things could be as possibly 3 years old by the time you actually work with them. And a lot can happen to a piece of wood in 3 years. They can actually warp on their own due to temperature variations, drying out, and humidity, and shipping. You know, have all kinds of temperature variations during shipping. But if you're not storing them properly, yeah, they can twist, they can warp, they can change their shape, have more or less crown in them by the time you get them and start working on them. So you can't just go, bam, trust it's perfect, or just complain that they can't make them right? It's a natural product. But you have to kind of look at how this wood matches up to this piece here as a guide. And then you want to keep the metal here pretty consistent all the way around. So in this particular car, obviously this needed pushed in a lot this way. And the center of the cowl needed to be pushed up from underneath before it was actually tacked in and put together and all drilled. But also on this car, we all noticed that none of this wood was actually installed correctly, in that the brackets behind here has holes for wood screws and stuff, and none of those wood screws are in there. So we don't even know how it's actually attached in there until we start tearing it apart to find out. So I did talk to the owner of the car, and he does want me to actually take this apart and try to correct all this if we can. Now it's time. And that's time that you don't figure on when you're first bringing a car in to start doing a final assembly on, like I'm doing here. So that's, you know, extra money, extra time, which backs the project up and of course costs more. But we also don't know what else we're going to run into. We may run into a lot more of this stuff, because I do notice that whoever actually did the assembly on the car, a lot of the bolts are simply aren't correct. The grill shell's not put together right. It's got really sharp screws running, big, huge screws running through there that are really sharp that you don't want because you can cut your hand on there, but also allows for no adjustment. These want to be, you want to be able to move those just slightly to get a good alignment. And we don't know what else we're going to run into. We do know the engine's got to come part way apart because it was built 15 years ago and it's never been started. So at a minimum, all the lifters and everything all have to come out so we can make sure the cam and everything's all lubed properly before we ever try to start it. I have put a camera down the bores. They all look good. It does turn over. So yeah, there's question marks there. And also, you know, he started this thing many years ago. I don't know how long it's been since he bought the top, the tonneau, and some of the other stuff. You can't let those things sit for years in the boxes and then try to install them, because at some point they won't be installable anymore, especially if they're vinyl. Now in this particular case, they were all the Stay Fast, which doesn't shrink nearly as much and it'll be much better. But you try to install a vinyl tonneau on an MGB that's been sitting in your attic for 8 years, good luck. Throw that thing in the garbage. Same thing with the top. They shrink too much and they will not fit. So when you start doing restorations like this, you don't buy that stuff way ahead of time, because you may end up throwing it away and starting over.